let's talk about the dispute lifecycle. A dispute between a cardholder and a merchant is usually mediated between their banks, the issuing bank of the cardholder, and the acquiring bank representing the merchant. It usually starts with a chargeback by the issuing bank, that is, a demand to make good on a cardholder loss. And there are three possible steps to this process. Let's take a look at these. When a dispute occurs, a specific flow is triggered, which involves both the issuing bank, representing the cardholder of the card used in the purchase, and the acquiring or merchant bank, representing the merchant in the transaction. There are three possible stages in this process. By possible, I mean that they don't necessarily always occur, all of them, but if they do occur, it's always in this order. The first step is what is called a retrieval request. So when a cardholder brings a dispute to an issuer bank before the chargeback stage, which is where they demand the money back, this step may occur. It's before it. In this step, the issuer requests documentation from the merchant supporting a transaction through the acquiring bank, and the acquiring bank may fulfill this request, which means replying to the request or not at all. After this, we have the actual chargeback. A chargeback, technically, is the demand by an issuing bank to make good on a loss on a credit card. At this stage, the acquirer may dispute the chargeback, sending documentation or just accept it. If the dispute is not resolved during the first chargeback, then a second chargeback will occur. This is a new request by the issuing bank to make good on a loss, just like the first one. But in this case, it challenges the documents sent in the first one, and it may request more. Again, these may be sent or not. The existence of the second chargeback indicates that the first one was not resolved. Usually, there are no chargebacks after the second. If the situation is not resolved here, then a mediation process usually occurs. In the first stage, the retrieval request, the issuer sends a request for documentation supporting a transaction. The acquirer bank may send a response or not, which is called fulfilling the request. If the acquirer sends that response, it may contain the documentation or not. If it does contain it, it's considered a fulfillment, and if it's a response without documentation, it's considered a non-fulfillment. So you can have a non-response, or you can have a response that may fulfill or not the retrieval request. This information usually includes the sales draft for the transaction. In e-commerce or EMV transactions, the sales draft has usually already been sent by the system. But in case the merchant's legacy systems don't include it, then what is called a substitute draft is generated and sent to the issuer. Naturally, this is in case the acquirer bank desires to fulfill the request. They may not. Usually, acquirer banks are in fact motivated to fulfill these requests because they want to avoid chargebacks. So whenever an issuer sends a request, the acquirer bank usually quickly coordinates with the merchant to send the required information right away. The second step is the chargeback, which technically is the demand by the issuer to be reimbursed for their loss. This can take the format of a financial record to be settled or a case in the dispute management system. The issuer usually provides what is called a reason code for the chargeback, which may represent fraud or an authorization error, a processing error, or a consumer dispute. And this reason code usually has the specific situation that generated the chargeback. If the acquirer does agree with the chargeback, they may explicitly acknowledge it or simply do nothing and let the transaction be settled. In case they do accept it, additionally, they may decide on whether to absorb the cost of the chargeback or force the merchant to absorb the cost themselves. If the acquirer bank does not agree with the chargeback, they can perform what is called a representment, also known as a second presentment of the information. In this case, they collect supporting documentation and the financial record of the transaction from the merchant, and then they present it to the issuer bank. This may include the cardholder's signature, evidence of shipment of goods, or other supporting materials. In some cases, if the issuer disagrees with the materials presented, if they're not good enough to dispute the chargeback, they can trigger a second chargeback. Just like the first one, it's a demand to make good on a cardholder's loss, and it usually states that the current documentation is not sufficient. If a second chargeback occurs, and the issuer and acquirer banks still cannot agree, then usually the payment scheme of their banking institution will arbitrate the dispute and make a decision themselves. This decision is usually in the form of the issuer bank being credited with the amount and the acquirer bank being debited with it. This is another reason why acquirer banks have the motivation to properly provide documentation and resolve chargeback disputes before it comes to this. What are some examples of the dispute lifecycle? The first is the case of a valid chargeback. If a valid chargeback occurs, the acquiring bank may acknowledge it and settle the record, or do nothing and let it be settled. Another example is the case of an invalid chargeback. If a chargeback is invalid, then the cardholder and the issuing bank representing them may drop the dispute after evidence is presented. And finally, the payment scheme, that is, the body that regulates the rules for banks, may make a decision themselves. The payment scheme of the specific banking institutions involved usually has a set of predetermined rules to automatically resolve disputes, in case where both parties cannot agree. What are our key takeaways here? The first is that this is usually a three-step process. The dispute between a cardholder and merchant and their respective banks usually has 3 steps, the last of them being optional: the retrieval request, the chargeback, and the second chargeback. Documentation is crucial in this process. Most chargeback disputes are resolved based on the documentation provided. It's either convincing enough to resolve a dispute, or the dispute remains. And finally, if the issuer and acquirer cannot agree in terms of the dispute, the payment scheme will be involved sooner or later. They may start by mediating the situation, but in most cases, they will end up actually arbitrating it. So as you see, there are 3 possible steps, and both banks go back and forth until the situation is resolved.